I did want to kind of shift focus to ESPN. Now they've done stuff in terms of like win projections with the Pistons, where they had them winning 20 games this season, which I kind of disagree with. But they did a survey recently with who is going to be the best player in 5 years, and I was really surprised. Ron Holland didn't get a single vote, Zar. Not a single vote. What are your thoughts on that?
Honestly, I'm not very surprised. I think this draft class is one that a lot of people, even now, don't know a whole lot about. Like, I remember going into the draft class, I'm not necessarily like a huge draft person. Like, don't get me wrong, I'll do my due diligence in terms of like knowing, because I cover the Pistons, generally like where the Pistons will be drafting, and then I'll generally look at like second round guys, like who could be like the surprises of the draft. But by no means am I a draft expert. I had more questions about the draft this year than I have ever had in like my years of covering and talking about the Detroit Pistons. And I think it's really just because people don't know. Like, there's no real like star player. Like, it was billed as Alex Sarr, but he, I mean, obviously early, but like didn't have the summer league performance to really back it up. And even then, his hype is not even comparable to like a Paulo or a Chet a few years ago. So it doesn't surprise me that someone like Ron Holland, coming from the G League Ignite, which is a system that's shutting down, like it will not be running anymore. It doesn't surprise me that a lot of people don't really know much about Ron. I think a lot of people's expectations with the G League peaked with Jalen Green, and then Scoot was kind of remotely close to that general level. Because I remember that 2021 class had Kuminga, Isaiah Todd, Jalen Green, all come from the G League system. But 2022, it was a little more mixed. Like, it was a whole debate about like Scoot and Wemby and everything like that in the beginning of the draft process. But Scoot was one of those prospects that's such an anomaly. You know what I mean? Like, he's one of those guys that, like, similar to Ja in the 2019 class, like those are guys that like you don't see very often. So Scoot, standing out wasn't necessarily because people were checking for the G League Ignite. It was more so just name recognition and seeing highlights and stuff like that. Ron Holland didn't really get the same luck, and he averaged pretty good numbers in the G League this year. He had a decent summer league performance. It's just the fact that that G League team didn't really win many games. And this draft class really has no hype or real coverage, especially coming from the Wemby like high. You know what I mean? Like, it was a serious high of draft coverage and draft talk and what's the future of the NBA going to look like. That like the very next year, looking at like what comes next, whoever it was is like, as long as there's not another Wemby in this class, it was never going to be able to compare. And I feel like people were just kind of on a low. So I think honestly the best player, and I who did they have as the best player in the draft? I wasn't able to check this out.
Okay, so Reed Shepherd had 8 votes. Stephon Castle had 3 votes. Donovan Clingan had 2 votes. Nikola Topic had 2 votes. Matas Pizzella, Stelton Connect, and Bob Carrington each got a vote.
Okay, so Reed Shepherd checks out because Reed, leading up to the draft, was someone who, I mean, I knew a lot of draft guys that liked him, but I didn't really hear of much hype about Reed Shepherd. Summer league performance, and all of a sudden, like, it's a lot of Reed Shepherd hype, and was he Cocaine Curry? Like, that's what they call him, right? So I think a lot of this is really just recency bias, and I think it's very likely that ranking will age really poorly, and it's simply just because a lot of times, like on platforms like this, people will get to like talking about, okay, you have to talk about the draft because the draft's coming up, or, like we have to rank who's going to be the best player. And you might not know, like it's one of those classes where like you probably don't know as much information as you did like last year, or even like this upcoming year with guys like Cooper Flagg. Like, it's one of those classes that really didn't get the proper coverage and proper insight. So it doesn't surprise me that guys like Ron Holland, who amongst, like the draft sickos, like the draft experts out there, was seen as like highest ceiling in the draft, doesn't really get the same by like the general basketball and sports population, because nobody really paid attention to the draft this year. There's more attention on the WNBA draft with like Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, etc., but not towards the NBA draft. So I really feel like the best player in this class probably didn't get a vote.
Yeah, it's kind of wild because like I'll say the only person that I've had on this podcast that was pounding his fist on the table was Hoop Intellect. He told me he's like Ron Holland, highest ceiling, could be the best player in the draft if the shot develops. Like it's not even close. Even like I saw Jonathan Wasserman from Bleacher Report had him as like his number one on his big board. So um I think what you said is fair in terms of just like people really didn't know because there was so much international players out there, and then you also had like G League Ignite guys, and not a whole lot of people watch the G League, and watching the G League can kind of be kind of a headache because it's just like, oh, is it on a YouTube stream or is it on a Facebook page or is it going to be on ESPN Plus this day? It's just I can understand why maybe ESPN wasn't the highest on Ron Holland because there's like no like clear evidence of him possibly developing a jump shot. I think Fred Vincent could work his magic personally. I'm kind of praying he can, but doesn't really surprise me whatsoever that ESPN is low on another Pistons prospect.
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised at all. I do think if all goes well, it will probably age pretty poorly because I really don't see why Ron Holland can't even be considered like a top 3 guy from this draft. I mean, he was drafted 5th overall. It shouldn't really be a hot take to say he could be one of the best players, if not the best player in the draft. But he has all the physical tools needed, and he has a lot of the intangibles needed in order to be a really productive NBA player. It's just like how high will his ceiling actually be versus like where it's projected to be. So a lot of this stuff's like a waiting game. And with prospects, I always have a hard time like getting like riled up or, like being like, oh, how can you not do this? Unless they're like a clear cut, like, just absolute generational talent. Like I considered Cade a generational talent in the 2021 NBA draft class. I don't think there's guys like Cade that like grow on trees. Because if you can name me a guy since the 2021 draft class that's comparable to Cade, I'd be wrong. He wouldn't be generational. But there hasn't been anybody since Cade that's really comparable. Like before him, there was Tyrese Halliburton, who kind of gets a little similar of love, but like it's not necessarily the same thing. You know what I mean? So I really feel like guys like that, guys like Victor, maybe even a guy like Cooper Flagg, like those are guys like if they're not talked about properly and if they're not ranked properly, it's a little easier to be like, okay, like what are we talking about here? But when it comes to a guy like Ron Holland, like you and I probably know, like, okay, it's possible for him to like be the best player in the draft. And like people aren't taking into consideration his defense. And, like if his shot comes along, that's really all he's missing. But most people don't really take that into consideration. They just look at how he is and they look at like the projected growth on a pretty like pessimistic level so that it's not really, tangible that he's going to be the best player in the draft.
Yeah, like let's just say he wasn't in Detroit. Let's say he was in San Antonio. Guarantee you would have got a vote.
Oh, okay, that part too. Yeah, I mean, honestly, the Pistons, I would like to say get an unfair shake at this, but in all honesty, it's kind of earned at this point that like they don't really get the same love and same like, oh, well, now they're in this system, like, they have a serious chance to like reach their maximum potential. Cause like, I mean, even as of last year, you had a guy like Jaden Ivey who was seen as like a blue chip prospect, like on the bench, uncertain minutes. You know what I mean? Like it hasn't been a system historically where players really maximize their potential. It's a thing amongst all Pistons fans that guys reach their potential once they leave here, like the whole Dinwiddie, Chris Middleton thing. So I can't fault them. That's the unfortunate part. I can't really fault like ESPN or just the general consensus for not believing in Detroit's development system so far.